So, where do you want to work from today? The coffee shop? The beach? It's all possible with virtual desktop infrastructure. My name is Helen Gidney, Softcat's Head of Architecture, and welcome back to Softcat's Explain It podcast. Every episode, we're here to talk tech in simple, jargon-free language. Virtual desktop infrastructure, or VDI, lets you access your company systems from almost anywhere. Essentially, you can carry your office in your pocket. But with potentially infinite interfaces, how do you keep VDI working for everyone? How do you manage it effectively? How do you keep it secure? In today's episode, we'll peel back the layers of VDI with the help of our expert guests, Jack Lewis, Softcat's Chief Technologist for Digital Workspace, and Tom Archer, Director of Sales for EMEA at Nerdio. Welcome, guys. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Helen.
So, let's start really simple. What is VDI?
You want to take that one, Jack?
Can do, yeah. So simply put, VDI is a way of delivering workspace in the form of desktops and applications to end users. But just to bring that to life a little bit, we take VDI out of the picture and talk about a more traditional way of delivering desktops and apps. What you've got there that isn't VDI is physical endpoint, so that could be a laptop or a desktop with an operating system on, mostly Windows in the enterprise and commercial world, with applications then installed, all managed centrally by something like an Intune. So that's a more traditional way of doing things. VDI complements that, but it's very different because what you've got is a central location, either cloud-based or in your own on-premises data center potentially, where you virtualize applications and desktops and then stream them to your end users. So those two ways of delivering workspace can complement each other, but the difference between traditional and VDI is, as I've said there.
Okay, great. And do we see customers running both? Is that something customers can do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's rare that VDI is for all use cases within an organization. We typically see, look, depending on the industry, but 20, 30% VDI and the rest physical. What do you think, Jack?
Yeah. So what we've been talking to customers about a lot, certainly over the last 5-6 years, is VDI where it's appropriate. And that's because workspace and the way that customers want to consume and deliver workspace has changed. I mean, VDI has been around for probably the best part of 25, 30 years now in some way, shape or form. Up until probably 6 or 7 years ago, was probably considered the gold standard in terms of how to deliver workspace to those end users. But it wasn't without its problems. Namely, it can become quite costly, and business cases around VDI in that traditional on-premises world were very difficult to write and justify because of the investment that was required in management software and particularly in infrastructure. But also VDI does require a fairly decent connection that is solid in order to be able to connect into those applications and desktops. And in the real world of today, that's not always going to be the case. Sometimes your end users want to be productive on trains and planes. So very often what we find is it's use case specific. That's where the VDI where appropriate thing comes in. And that's where you can deliver the best workspace experience to your end users that's then highly productive, makes users very happy, allows them to communicate and collaborate effectively. And as I said, you can get the best of both worlds because those use cases, which we'll come on to, Tom, for VDI can be very powerful, such as, for example, isolating applications that have really sensitive information inside of them. Or if you want to do things like strict versioning control, that's not necessarily easy with things like Intune. If you imagine you've got 1,000 devices, for example, if you need to update an application and you want that to happen instantly, in the real world, 600 of those endpoints with that application may update within a day or so, but the other 400 may be delayed for one reason or another. With VDI, one of the really powerful use cases is you update that image once, you press the button, and potentially within a couple of seconds, everybody's on that latest version, and then you wrap those security controls around it. So absolutely, certainly in large enterprises and specific verticals, we're starting to see that VDI where it's appropriate, where they've got a mix of traditional with modern management and then applications and desktops being delivered virtually where it makes sense to do so. You seen that as well?
Yeah, and I just want to go back to something that you said around the cost of VDI. Like, if we go back to typical on-premise VDI, even to spin up a POC, right, you could have had to put all the infrastructure in the data center, buy the licensing on top to build out the stack, right? And that was a kind of barrier to entry before. Like, we'll come on to today and DAS and how that's probably changed. But
Yeah.
I think that was a real, the cost of all the different layers of components that you needed with VDI was massive.
By the time you'd run the proof of concept, you needed it to be successful because you'd already invested so much in the infrastructure and the licensing and the consultancy and the services that wrap around it. That was always a real problem. And then you ended up in scenarios where potentially that VDI then grew beyond the scope of what it was meant to do. And then the infrastructure started not being able to provide the right level of resource. So then the experience was effective and you ended up in a bit of a cycle of like bad productivity, bad experience, and VDI getting blamed.
But talking about the outlay of cost for a traditional on-premise VDI, the need for that really secure and consistent connectivity, and then all the outlay, meaning that you kind of have to continue with that going forward because you're stuck in the cycle of the infrastructure refresh. Is that why we're seeing really popular cloud VDI platforms, AVD being one of the leading in the market, popping up now and customers using that instead?
Yeah, I think, look, people kind of say, why do we still need VDI at all, or DAS, over just typical desktops? And I think, look, a lot of the same challenges still exist that were there 10, 15 years ago. You mentioned one of them around securing apps, securing data. A lot of organizations don't want the sensitive data on the laptop that the user can leave on the train or something like that, right? They want that held centrally. And there's lots of these use cases still. And this DAS approach, where it's a hosted solution, you can spin it up, spin it down, has really helped with lots of those use cases. So I think third-party access, right? You get a outsourcer coming in to run some services within your business. You don't want to ship them kit to wherever they are in the world, but you also don't want to have to wait till you've built the infrastructure in the data center to be able to spin up the VDI. You want to get people online within 10 minutes, 20 minutes. We see a lot. People use outsourcers. The people working for that outsourcer change very frequently. There's a lot of turnover. And people just want to get those people online so they can support the business as quickly as possible. Kind of the same with M&A, right? Mergers and acquisitions, trying to bring that new organization into your organization is how quickly can I get these people access to my systems? Well, with DAS that we'll come on to, it's 10 minutes, right? You spin up the machine, it's there, give them the login details and off you go. So look, Gartner's saying that this market's still going to grow significantly through 2030. This is something that's not going away, but there's kind of been that murmuring, why do we still need VDI, right? Everyone's got a laptop, do we still need it? But there's lots of these use cases. And another one that we're seeing, I don't know about you, you're hearing this, Jack, but that the kind of environmental reasons, right? People don't want to replace laptops every 3 years, right? Because there's a big carbon impact on building laptops and shipping them to wherever you need them. So actually keeping that device, repurposing that device, and then accessing a desktop from a cloud location hosted service, then we're seeing a lot of that because it moves the scope emissions from scope 2 to scope 3 emissions, which is really important for organizations right now.
Yeah, so you've covered two really, really, really good use cases for virtual desktop there. So contractors that you mentioned there, absolutely fantastic use case. And M&A, let's deliver a desktop down, but also the sustainability element. It is important, right? And especially, I know we're going to talk about Azure Virtual Desktop in a second. Microsoft have made some pretty significant commitments to like carbon neutral and other things related to sustainability, which means if you run your infrastructure in their data centers, Azure, by proxy, that is then aligned to those commitments that they've made. So it can make your life easier as an organization to start to, deliver your workspace, which is a really important part of IT service as a whole, more sustainably, like a really quick, good way of doing things if you go down that road. So yeah, it's an important thing to call out. And as you said there's also a circular economy element to this and a remanufacturing element to it, where if there are some aging devices, what you could do is, rather than replace those devices where it makes sense to do so where it's VDI appropriate to do so, deliver a desktop or an application down to those endpoints, but run a reduced operating system on them. So something from one of our partners like iGel, for example, which is, lightweight, easy to secure and manage. And the entire purpose of that operating system is to get you people into that VDI environment as quickly and effectively as possible. So yeah, we definitely are seeing that, which is, reinforces the VDI where appropriate, and there's still appropriate use cases for VDI. We're still seeing it everywhere. We still use it a little bit inside Softcat as well. So we primarily deliver our workspace through premium devices, centrally managed through Intune, but our business applications are predominantly delivered through VDI technologies, because some of them are a little bit gnarly maybe. They need to sit next to a database with low latency. We want to do versioning control, where we want to really effectively protect the information that sits inside of those business applications. So even inside Softcat, we've got use cases for it, and we see that everywhere.
Yeah, we're the same. Yeah, certain applications within Nerdio you can only access through the virtual desktop, right? I run Outlook locally, I run Teams locally, but when I need to go and access certain applications, it's through AVD for us as well. And look, there's tons of other use cases we haven't touched upon there. The other one is that really jumps out is same kind of thing around the right device, repurposing devices, is high performance compute. How much do those devices cost? 10 grand maybe to go and buy a real high spec device. Actually, if that user only needs it for a few hours a week to do certain tasks, they don't need it for every part of their job, then again, that's a great use case for DAS, right? You can spin it up and spin it down as that user needs it. So
we see that use case in universities, don't we? I know that we're working on a couple of opportunities together with universities where in the past they've invested in really high spec machines that sit in classrooms that don't get the utilization out of them to justify the spend. So the ROI to the university is difficult to justify why they've gone down that route maybe. So they're looking for alternative ways to replace those machines because they need to. Well, as you said there, let's stick a thin client in those classrooms, put a lightweight operating system on them and run those workloads in the cloud, but manage them effectively using something like an Nerdio, which we'll come on to in a second.
So you talked a lot there about some really good points about why you would use a cloud VDI platform, the flexibility, the security, the work anywhere, the spinning up high performance sessions. But we see lots of cloud VDI platforms in the market, but AVD seems to be far and away the winner. So what is Azure Virtual Desktop AVD and why is it so popular?
Sure, so I can cover that. So Azure Virtual Desktop is Microsoft's cloud-based VDI offering. Caveat on the cloud-based, because as of February this year, you can actually run it on premises now via Azure Stack HCI, but we'll come back to that. So just put a pin in that for a second. If we talk about, there were three things that Azure Virtual Desktop, in my opinion, brought to the world of VDI when it released about 5.5 years ago that just shook the market, just injected some relevance and pace into that world of VDI. So the first thing we've covered in the first part of this podcast, which was the fact that in that old world of VDI, if you roll the clock back 10 years, you had to size for worst case scenario. So if I were doing a VDI deployment 10 years ago and I was a 1,000 user company, I would have to size my infrastructure for the amount of time that I want to sweat the assets. So if I want to invest now in a load of compute, storage, networking to power my VDI environment, I can't do that for 1,000 users if the organization is going to be 1,500 users in 3 or 5 years. So I've got to size for that worst case concurrency, which means ultimately I'm not going to get full value out of that investment because let's be real, at no point in time is it ever fully concurrent. If you've got 1,000 users, some of those people are going to be out visiting customers, some of them are going to be on holiday and unavailable, or for whatever reason, they might be part-time, they might not need access all at the same time. So that was always a problem, especially when it came to trying to justify why we're going down this VDI route, because of how expensive it was. And you could only obviously scale it one way, well, up or out. You couldn't scale it down because you'd bought that infrastructure and stuck it in your own data center. So the first thing AVD brought was the ability for you to only pay for what you use because you host it in Azure. which is pay per second or a minute. And what that allowed customers to do first and foremost is run small-scale proof of concepts, kick the tires on Azure Virtual Desktop, and understand whether the use case that they've identified for AVD is a good one or a bad one. If it's good, expand it. If it's bad, shut it down, move on to the next project. So you can't understate how significant that was, that first thing. So just wanted to just reinforce that. The second thing, which is a bit more technical, is that Microsoft looked at the way VDI was delivered. And essentially with VDI, you've got your back-end resources, so your compute, your storage and your networking, where your images and your applications and your desktops sit. And then you've got a middle layer between the client and that desktop or application that they're trying to access, sometimes referred to as the control plane. I sometimes call them VDI services. Ultimately, they're a necessary thing that needs to be in place, needs to be fed, watered, maintained, kept available, load balanced, or your end users cannot access those workspace services, which is a real problem because, number one, that's infrastructure that you've got to size yourself and pay for. But also, if that stuff stops behaving or falls down or falls over for whatever reason, suddenly nobody can access the desktop and applications. So what Microsoft did is they looked at that and went, okay, as long as you have the right licensing and it's included in the Microsoft 365 license, which lots of customers already have access to, you no longer need to worry about that. They deliver that to you as software as a service, as a part of Azure Virtual Desktop at no additional cost. So those control plane services, sometimes called broker, gateway, high availability, load balancing, diagnostics, etc., that's no longer a thing that you need to worry about. Microsoft just do that for you. That was significant, and it was available in other products, but not necessarily included in that base licensing that customers already had access to with Microsoft. So again, more cost effective, less to worry about. The third thing, which again is quite technical but also very significant, is they introduced a multi-session or a multi-user version of Windows that could run in Azure. Now, what does that mean? Essentially, it bridges the gap that existed in the world of VDI previously, where in that world of 10 years ago, if you delivered a VDI desktop from your on-premises infrastructure, that was one-to-one. So if you had 1,000 users, you needed 1,000 virtual machines, which means you needed a lot of resources behind the scenes to power that. The other alternative was you went down the most desktop services route, which is the server version of the operating system, and you could have multiple users logged onto a single virtual machine, which was more dense and cost effective, but then your applications might not be compatible and there are isolation issues. This version of Windows that Microsoft released that was tied to Azure Virtual Desktop only gave you the best of both worlds. You got the desktop version of the operating system, but with multiple users being able to log onto it. So again, going back to that scenario, if you've got 1,000 users, you don't need 1,000 desktops necessarily anymore. You might be able to get away with maybe 100 virtual machines, or maybe 50 or 200, depending on what your workload is and the virtual machine performance that you've got behind the scenes will dictate the sizing. That's all fantastic. So those were three major innovations that it brought to the market that customers loved, but it did introduce a challenge as well, and it was a major one around management. In the early days, we roll the clock back 5.5 years when AVD was first announced, in order to manage it.
WVD at the time, wasn't it, Jack? Yeah.
Windows Virtual Desktop at the time, WVD, they changed the name. You had to write a lot of PowerShell, a lot of ARM, which is professional development stuff, in order to actually manage this stuff. It was an almost impossible task. Now, since then, about 2 years later on, Microsoft did improve the tools that are made available to customers, but they still leave a lot to be desired. Hence the reason why we've got Nerdio on the podcast, because they have a product that allows you to manage and size and optimize that Azure Virtual Desktop environment really effectively. So Tom, I'd love to invite you to talk a little bit about what Nerdio does in that world to complement those three major innovations that AVD brought to the market.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, back to some of the points that you just said there around Microsoft's investment in this space, right? Anyone listening to the pod, if you if you POC'd or trialed AVD or WVD at the time, lots of people did because it was COVID, right? Everyone's like, how do I get my users online? Try WVD at the time. And look, the experience that customers got, I think Microsoft wouldn't mind us saying that it was an early version of WVD at the time, right? It wasn't.
Work in progress.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, Microsoft's a partner-first company. So if you look at the strategy behind the scenes, they would have built the APIs and hooked into the Azure automation capabilities behind the scenes, expecting partners like yourselves to build those products.
Absolutely, yeah. But even like the RDP protocol, right? That was, hey, look, they've invested so much money in improving the RDP protocol, which is effectively what connects the user to the session. And so if you get poor connectivity, low latency, things like that, that's where you really need a good protocol. And Microsoft have put so much investment into that technology, which now, look, we got customers who are in India on poor connectivity, connecting back to UK data centers. We've got people in Australia in finance, connecting back to UK data centers, Singapore, you know, and the effort Microsoft's put into that, because ultimately they want people to move their desktops to the cloud, right, to Azure, because that's what Microsoft kind of want to build their business around. So look, that has really enhanced the technology. But back to your question around Nerdio, why Nerdio, why do we exist? Well, as you said, there's still lots of kind of gaps in the Microsoft platform and the AVD stack. And really that's around that management of the solution. So lots of people who are moving to AVD have had some VDI before, maybe one of the more traditional legacy VDI providers who've been around for that 10, 15, 20 years. And with those technologies, you get lots of tooling, which allows you to do the day-to-day tasks that you need to do, right? The image management, the managing user sessions, building hosts, all of these kind of different tasks that you need to do with VDI. And Microsoft, as you said, that they kind of rely on partners to deliver that for them. You can do it with their solution, but you still need to kind of build DevOps pipelines and things like that, which for most organizations, they don't have the skill sets within their end user computing team who typically run this, that also know the image management and that side of it. And then they have this skill set around cloud management, DevOps, things like that. So there's a gap there that we see in the market around that management. And that's where Nerdio comes in. So automating all of those tasks for customers so that they don't need that skill set. But the other big thing is, we spoke about it earlier around, you pay for Azure and Azure Virtual Desktop to Microsoft based on seconds, minutes, hours of utilization, right? You're paying when machines are powered on, whether they're being used or not. So one of the most important things to deliver this in a cost-effective way is making sure that you're managing those resources really dynamically. So you want those resources there when the users need to use them, but when the users don't need to use them, you want them powered off, you want them deleted, you want them tuned down to the kind of lowest spec that you could possibly do, because that's when you start being able to deliver these desktops at £5-6 a month, you know, if it's one of these shared multi-session environments for kind of a basic use case, you can really drive that cost down. Because look, people aren't working 15-hour days every day of the week, right? You only need these machines on 6-7 hours, as you said. Everyone takes holiday, sick leave. So actually, if you look at what is the runtime of desktops across a month, across a year, it's not full 12-hour days, 5 days a week, right? It's much lower than that. So if you really dial down and use that auto scaling that Nerdio provides, this technology, you really can drive out that Azure cost that goes with this AVD solution.
Yeah, agree. That auto scaling complements Azure Virtual Desktop so nicely.
So the advisors are suite within the Nerdio platform that does a few things. Firstly, it allows you to model out what the cost will likely be for your use case. So you can quickly go in there, a few basic inputs around work hours, how much resource people need, and things like that. And you can get hey, look, this is probably roughly my run cost on a monthly basis per user per month. That's the first thing that the advisor suite does. The other thing it does, though, is it's always watching, once you've built the environment, how it's actually being utilized. Yes, you can set something up, and you mentioned in kind of old school VDI on premise, you just have to build it as big as you need it, right? And then you've got it, it's in the data center. Well, that's not the case with these DAS resources. So Nerdio's advisor is always watching and then giving you feedback to say, hey, look, you've given these 200 users this spec VM. You think that they thought they needed a 4-core 16 gig machine, but actually they're not using 30% of that resource. So you can dial them down, and it's literally a click of the button to say, change these 200 machines from that 4-core, 8-core, whatever it is machine, change them down to a 2-core machine, click the button. By clicking this button, it's going to save me X per month, right? So really easy to go back to the business and justify the work that the team are doing, and also, right, really drive that cost down to what the cost needs to be. So that's the advisor suite, and we're continuing to develop that to add more intelligence in there. So ultimately, this is becoming a bit of a self-managing platform, right? This can just, you don't even need to go and click the button. It can just observe and then say, hey, look, when people aren't using the resources, we'll just change them. So that's the advisor suite. The second question was around the auto scaling, right? So yeah, there's tons that you can do with that, because there's so many different components of this Azure Virtual Desktop solution. There's the compute, there's the machines, which is the compute. There's the disks that go with those machines, the OS disk effectively. That's a different cost from Microsoft. And then there's the storage, the file storage that goes with these as well, so Azure files. So there's lots of different things that Nerdio does around all of those. So a really interesting one that people kind of don't think about is, so compute you pay per minute, per hour, per day to Microsoft. The disk you pay per month, right? So if the disk is there, you're paying for it whether the machine is powered on or off. You still pay for the disk. Compute you only pay if the machine is powered on. So what Nerdio does is, look, in the multi-session environments that you were talking around there, the multi-session Windows devices, most people are using premium SSDs, right? That's the performance that people need for the devices. But when that machine is powered off, you would still be paying for that premium SSD to Microsoft, because you always pay for that. So what Nerdio does is it swaps the disk type when the machine is powered down to the cheapest SKU that's available within the Azure data center, which is actually about 70% cheaper than the premium SSDs that people use. So no impact to user experience because the machine's powered off, no one's using it, but you're just seeing 70% cost saving for that time that the machine isn't powered off. And we spoke about people working 8 hours a day, not every day. If you kind of start to extrapolate that out, right, then there's big savings. So we're always looking for where we can save more money. Is there different component costs? Where can we optimize further to really drive down that cost per user? Because the flexibility that you get with AVD is you can just build things, change them. Your business changes, your VDI needs to change, right? Because you might need more compute, you might need less compute, and AVD gives you the flexibility to change it, but you need a tool that allows you to make that change. So that's really where Nerdio comes in.
And that's a great point. One of the big pieces we hear from our customers is the challenge with cloud is that spiraling cost. The flexibility to start it or stop it is great, but once you're in, you expand quite rapidly. And the amazing pieces that Nerdio can add on there to keep that cost really effective. Looking back at that traditional infrastructure where we started of you have to size this for the next 5 years, and once you're in, that improvement and change we've seen is incredible. And really comes back to the points you were making right at the beginning about sustainability and flexibility. It takes that sustainability and flexibility right to the limit of what we can do by adding Nerdio to AVD, which is amazing. But Jack, earlier you mentioned that Microsoft have allowed from February to host virtual desktop on Azure Stack HCI. So where does that fit into all of this?
It's part of a wider or a broader picture of how you deliver workspace, in my opinion. And it just increases the amount of options that you've got with Azure Virtual Desktop. So what this allows customers to do is, for compliance reasons or for cost reasons, and I'm specifically talking about running graphics or GPUs in Azure, it may be prohibitive for that customer to run that workload for VDI in the cloud. Now, prior to February with AVD, you couldn't do that, so you'd need some sort of hybrid solution. But as of today, assuming you've got supported certified infrastructure, of which there's a list on the Azure Stack HCI website on Microsoft.com, what you can do is you can run those AVD desktops on premises, powered by the Azure Stack HCI infrastructure. Now, Azure Stack HCI, just to do a level set on that, is essentially an operating system provided by Microsoft that plugs back into Azure. The great thing about this is we've touched on Nerdio in terms of it managing workloads in Azure, but it can also do the same for Azure Stack HCI. So we're seeing customers now, even though it's early days, it was only made generally available in February, for certain workloads, i.e. compliance related or high performance graphics compute related, start to size their on-premises infrastructure for that, but then burst into the cloud and run workloads in the cloud again where it's appropriate. So it'd be good to touch on that because we know that Nerdio can do management of that as well as Windows 365 as well.
Yeah, we had our partner conference actually back in February, and Scott Manchester, who runs this technology at Microsoft, he's the product owner for Azure Virtual Desktop, and he was talking and said this was actually, there was a Gartner Magic Quadrant in August, September last year, and this was a kind of cross in the Microsoft box that they didn't have a hybrid option. You couldn't deliver Azure Virtual Desktop on-premise, and customers still have use cases. Maybe they have to keep the data in their data center. It can't go to the cloud, or maybe applications are in the data center still, so they need to keep the desktop close to the application. And Microsoft launching this has really then finished that solution for customers, where you can have some workloads on-premise, you can have some workloads in Azure, and you can still manage it all under the same banner. So Nerdio sees them exactly the same, whether it's in Azure or whether it's seen in on-premise using Azure Stack HCI, right? We're seeing that as the same. You can use the same image for both. You can manage it in the same way. So yeah, we, excuse me, we see it as the same desktop. So that's Azure Stack HCI, and I think it's going to become a big use case, right? There's lots of on-premise VDI with reasons why it isn't moving to Azure, and I think this is just going to open up more opportunity for Microsoft.
There is a story there as well where customers who have recently invested in hyper-converged infrastructure, assuming it's on the supported certified list, could continue to sweat that asset, run those workloads using Azure Stack HCI, get value out of them, or continue to get value out of them, but then maybe slowly start to migrate more and more up into Azure. Because I think we're still, with customers, we're obviously talking about VDI and AVD where it's appropriate. The appropriate place to put those workloads is probably going to be Azure, unless you've got a specific reason to do so, which we've already covered. But again, you could sweat those assets if you've already got them, which is great, and then burst up to the cloud for that period of time. And Nerdio, of course, allows you to do that.
Absolutely, yeah. You said that most people are putting it in Azure. I think Gartner said 90% of DAS workloads are in Azure. So look, if you're looking for a place to put your DAS workloads, Microsoft seem like the safe bet right now for customers. But you also said something else around Windows 365. So I'm not sure if all the listeners will know what Windows 365 is, but it's effectively another DAS offering from Microsoft. But whereas Azure Virtual Desktop give customers the flexibility to build whatever they want in the environment, what Windows 365 is a packaged desktop, cloud PC, that Microsoft call it, where you effectively pay a per user per month fee for a specific desktop. So you get a 4-core, 16 gig desktop in Azure that Microsoft have built for you, and you pay a per user per month fee. So it's another great technology from Microsoft, right? If you have use cases where everyone needs a personal desktop one-to-one. We spoke earlier around multi-session compute and the economies of scale of doing that, but there is still use cases where customers want to give their users an individual desktop. So that's Windows 365, a good use case for that. And the important thing to look at if I was a customer there is, what's the runtime? How much usage do I have of my virtual desktop? Because you're paying per user per month with Windows 365, if the device is only used for half of the month, then you're better to use the Azure Virtual Desktop, because that's a consumption cost you're paying per minute, per hour in Azure Virtual Desktop. So if you've got users who do need a personal cloud VDI, where it's one-to-one device mapping, and they use it as their primary device for 8, 9, 10 hours a day, then Windows 365 is a great option. That's where that starts to become kind of more cost-effective. If you can get them onto that shared multi-session compute environment, or if it's kind of something that people are using for some of their role, that's probably where Azure Virtual Desktop is is going to be the right solution. What do you think, Jack? Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect summary. In my mind, we're seeing some use cases with Windows 365 where customers have spun up an initial small-scale proof of concept so they can understand what desktop as a service from Microsoft is, how it feels, how it looks. So that might be a small-scale 5-10 users, but as you said there, the total cost of ownership associated with Windows 365 is a lot higher versus multi-session Azure Virtual Desktop as you start to increase number of users on the platform. The benefit of Windows 365 is operational overhead is a lot less, but also flexibility is reduced again versus Azure Virtual Desktop. So again, it's where it's appropriate, VDI where appropriate, so you've got your appropriate use cases, and then you've got Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365 where it's appropriate. And in large enterprises, realistically, we'll probably see a mixture of all three, where we might see some applications being delivered from Azure Stack HCI, from the on-premises data center for compliance reasons. We might see desktops being delivered from the cloud using Azure. And we might see, again, desktops maybe being delivered to deskless or frontline workers using Windows 365, but again, all managed via Nerdio so that you can effectively control and maintain and keep things fed and watered and optimized from a single place.
Agreed. And look, we spoke about the advisor a minute ago, right? You know what the cost is for Windows 365. You can go and ask Microsoft. It's a per user per month fee. With the Nerdio advisor, you can cost model what that use case would look like in AVD. And then you can quickly see, okay, well, this use case is better for Windows 365, or this use case is better for AVD because I can get my per user per month cost out of the Nerdio cost modeler, and then you can get your Windows 365 cost from Microsoft. So that's a really helpful tool if you're trying to work out, hey, Microsoft has given me these technologies, which one's best? Well, let's look at the cost of both for the use case.
Yeah, and Softcat can help with that.
To summarise, if customers are thinking they need flexible working, think Microsoft. And if they're thinking Microsoft, really, they should be thinking Nerdio on top to keep that simplicity, that cost, that flexibility, and that sustainability on point.
Exactly that, Helen.
You got it.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I think we've covered some fantastic points there and some really interesting pieces in the topic.
Thanks, Helen.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. And thanks to Softcat. We really appreciate the partnership, and thanks for inviting us here today.
Yeah, cheers, Tom.
So, if you want to listen to more episodes from this season, we release them every month. Alternatively, you can download or stream all episodes from every season from your preferred device. We'll be back next month with another episode to talk tech in simple jargon-free language. Thank you for listening to Explain It.